In utility theory, the idea of marginal utility is important because it tells us if individuals are consuming a good are better off or not. Marginal utility is the additional amount of utility an individual gets from consuming an additional unit of a good or service. The first two formulas are conceptual. The first formula uses the Greek letter delta. The Greek letter delta has a special place in science. It's used to indicate or represent the word change. So the first two formulas are really saying the same thing. The marginal utility is the change in total utility divided by the change in the number of goods consumed. However, neither of these two formulas are terribly practical for working problems involving marginal utility. So the third formula gives us a practical way of working with utility. The formula that this video uses is the quantity of Tu2 minus Tu1 divided by the quantity of C2 minus C1. Tu represents total utility, C represents the consumption of a particular good or service. The process for calculating marginal utility is 1. Write down the total utility formula. 2. Select the first level of consumption as C1. 3. Select the second level of consumption as C2. Select the amount of total utility associated with C1 and label it Tu1. Select the amount of total utility associated with C2 and label it Tu2. Substitute in the first value for consumption for C1. Substitute in the second value of consumption for C2. 8. Substitute in the first total utility for Tu1. Substitute in the second value of total utility for Tu2. Subtract C1 from C2. Subtract Tu1 from T2. Divide the difference in the total utility by the difference in consumption. Move down one row and repeat the process until all the rows have been completed. Let's look at an example of calculating marginal utility. Here's part of the table representing Joe's consumption of pizza and the total utility that he received from consuming the pizza. First, we need to calculate the marginal utility. Remember that the formula is the quantity of Tu2 minus Tu1 divided by the quantity of C2 minus C1. Notice at 0 prices of pizza, we have one level of consumption, 0, and one level of total utility, 0. Unfortunately, there's no second amount of consumption and no second amount of utility to work with. Since there's no amount of either consumption or utility, the calculation is not applicable. Thus, there's no marginal utility to calculate. You can put NA next to the first entry in the table or a dash to indicate that the marginal utility cannot be calculated at this point. Next, move down a row on the table and see if the marginal utility can be calculated. The next row contains consumption of 1 and a total utility of 10. Let's start by writing down the formula. Since there are two data points, one data point is the 0 consumption and the 0 utility. The second data point is the consumption of one piece of pizza and a utility of 10 units. Since there are two data points, the marginal utility can be calculated. Next, let's identify the two levels of consumption and the two levels of total utility. The first level of consumption is 0 pieces of pizza, so identify that level of consumption with C1. The second level of consumption is C2. The level of total utility associated with a consumption of 0 piece of pizzas is 0. So we're going to label it TU1. The amount of total utility associated with the consumption of 1 slice of pizza is 10. So label it TU2. Notice the C1 and the TU1 belong to the same level of consumption, and the C2 and the TU2 are paired together as well. Next, locate C1 in the table and in the formula. Notice that 0 is associated with C1 in the table. And substitute the value of C1, 0, into the formula. Next, locate C2 in the formula and in the table. Notice that 1 is associated with C2 in the table. Next, substitute C2, 1, into the formula. Locate TU1 in the table and in the formula. Notice that 0 is associated with TU1 in the table. Substitute the value 0 into the formula for TU1. Locate TU2 in the formula and in the table. Notice that 10 is associated with TU2 in the table. Substitute 10 into the formula for TU2. Next, subtract 0 from 1, which gives 1. Next, subtract 0 from 10, which gives 10. Next, divide 10 by 1, which gives 10. Write 10 next to the second line numbers, because this is the marginal utility of consuming 1 additional piece of pizza, going from 0 to 1. Let's see if we can calculate the marginal utility for 2 pieces of pizza. First, you're going to move C1, C2, TU1, and T2 down 1 row of the table. Write down the formula for calculating the marginal utility, which is the quantity of TU2 minus T1 divided by the quantity of C2 minus C1. Locate C1 in the table and in the formula. Notice that 1 is associated with C1. Next, substitute 1 into the formula for C1. Locate C2 in the table. Notice that 2 is associated with C2. Substitute 2 in for C2 in the formula. Next, locate TU1 in the formula and in the table. Notice that 10 is associated with TU1. Substitute 10 into the formula for TU1. Locate TU2 in the table and in the formula. Notice that 16 is associated with TU2. Substitute 16 into the formula for TU2. Next, subtract 1 from 2, which gives 1. Next, subtract 10 from 16, giving 6. Next, divide 6 by 1, giving 6. Write the marginal utility 6 next to the third row of numbers. Move C1, C2, TU1, TU2 down one row to a new set of numbers. So we're going to be calculating the marginal utility of the consumption of moving from 2 pieces of pizza to 3. First, write down the formula for calculating the marginal utility. The formula is the quantity of TU2 minus TU1 divided by the quantity of C2 minus C1. Next, locate C1 in the formula and in the table. Notice that C1 is associated with a value of 2. Substitute the 2 into the formula for C1. Next, locate C2 in the formula and in the table. Notice that 3 is associated with C2, representing 3 pieces of pizza. Substitute 3 into the formula for C2. Locate TU1 in the table and in the formula. Notice that 16 is associated with TU1. Substitute 16 into the formula for TU1. Locate TU2 in the formula and in the table. Notice that 19 is associated with TU2 in the table. Substitute 19 into the formula for TU2. Next, subtract 2 from 3, which gives 1. Next, subtract 16 from 19, which gives 3. Next, divide 3 by 1. So the marginal utility from going from 2 pieces of pizza to 3 pieces is 3. So write the 3 next to the last line of our table. You might want to pause the video and copy down the table from the screen and see if you can calculate the remaining marginal utilities. After completing the table, press play to view the answers. Here are the answers to the rest of the table. Hopefully you were able to find the missing marginal utilities.